This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. Let's begin. Ivan didn't grant us any rest. He wanted to roll up or encircle the bridgehead at Narva at all costs. Around noon on March 19th, the enemy attacked west from the East Sack after artillery and mortar preparation. He wanted to cut off the southern portion of the Boot, which had been held by us up to then. He then wanted to link the East Sack with the West Sack and create better jumping-off positions for further attacks. We knocked out 6 T-34s and a T-60 and destroyed a 76.2mm 8 gun. Despite all that, the Russians were successful in penetrating our front lines. Even before our own infantry could start the counterattack, we had to intervene in an emergency at another place. From the strong point north of the railway embankment came the report that 4 Russian assault guns had set up on the far side of the railway crossing in a small patch of woods. In addition, 2 Russian tanks had driven up to the right of the railway crossing. Feldwebel Kircher and I arrived just in the nick of time because a mood of panic had already overcome our infantry. There were no anti-tank weapons available besides our Tigers. We were able to knock out the enemy tanks before they started to attack and also come back in time to effectively support the counterattack of our infantry to the south. We did this from point 39.9 along the route from the Kinderheim to the Boot Sole. The marshy terrain there gave us a lot of problems. It simply wasn't possible to drive off the road. It was only through our fire that we could help our infantry friends in holding down the enemy. Operations in marshes are unpleasant and at the same time unsatisfying for any tanker. After 3 hours, the enemy was dislodged and our infantry had reached their old positions again. One officer deserves special mention here. Major Hasse stormed the Russian positions with unforgettable dash and courage at the head of his battalion. This type of action reminded me of the stories my father told of how in World War I, officers with drawn swords stormed ahead of their men. During the attack, we were able to destroy an additional 2 T-34s, but the Russians didn't want to call it quits. By the next morning at the break of dawn, they were again attacking at Lembitu in company-sized strength. They were thrown back after a 1-hour struggle. An attack around noon suffered the same fate. Once again, they lost 2 tanks and a 45mm anti-tank gun, but they still didn't give up. They selected an unusual hour to attack the next night. They charged our lines at 3 in the morning. We could only fire blindly in the darkness, and so Ivan finally succeeded in taking the ruins in the middle. We had learned from the rebuff we had suffered at the strong point at the railway embankment, and didn't wait too long this time. I executed a counterattack with 10 infantrymen, and 2 hours later, the ruins in the middle were again firmly in our hands. Despite the short time we had given the Russians, they had already hauled up 2 76.2mm 8 guns. At first, these gave us a lot of trouble. The reconquered set of ruins in the middle was of decisive importance to us. If it had been lost, the farmhouse would also have fallen soon after. The entire defensive front in our sector would have collapsed. Of course, it also had the same importance to the enemy. They renewed their attack 2 hours later. The ruins finally had to be evacuated again after 4 infantrymen, among them the leader of the strongpoint, had been killed. The remaining 6 men couldn't hold out against the Russian infantry and sought shelter in the farmhouse. We then arranged ourselves with all 3 tanks around the farmhouse. It had to be held at all costs. Because the infantry's radio had been knocked out by fire, I sent Feldwebel Gruber with his tank to the regimental command post to fetch replacements. It was impossible for the infantrymen to go back on foot. The Russians were really playing cat and mouse with us. They always attacked at the point where we weren't. Because of that, they ran us all over the place. In the afternoon, Feldwebel Kircher was able to knock out another 2 Russian tanks at point 33.7. Before the onset of darkness, we started a new counterattack against the middle ruins. A half-hour later, they were firmly in our hands. That was to be our final attack before we attacked the East Sack later on and established a better front line further south as part of Operation Strachwitz. The great numbers of casualties in men and materiel forced the Russians to take a breather. Our magnificent infantry were primarily responsible for that. They had performed in a superhuman manner during those days. In terms of numbers, They should have been too weak to hold their positions against the superior forces. Despite this, they had constantly attacked and displaced the enemy. This accomplishment can only be gauged by someone who has been in a similar situation. Words alone cannot describe such aggressiveness. After the situation had been restored, I set up my Tigers on the plain to cover the railway crossing. That wasn't a lot of fun for us. Due to their artillery and mortar fire, the Russians forced us to constantly change positions. We were completely without cover. The enemy could observe our every movement, especially since they had occupied the eastern ruins on our side of the railway embankment. They didn't give us any rest. As was always the case in such situations, I had ordered that no tanks were allowed to back up without having a neighboring vehicle give directions by radio. The commander of a moving Tiger could not see directly behind his tank. He was always in danger of getting stuck when moving backward, especially since the driver was completely blind. The track of the neighboring tank also had to be observed. When moving backward, it could ride up on the teeth of the drive sprocket, even during small turning movements, especially in mud and snow. If that happened, there was unbelievable tension, and the tank was immobilized. There was nothing left to do but cut apart the tracks. Despite all experience and reminders, there was a serious mishap. While under fire, Feldwebel Gruber suddenly put his tank in reverse and drove straight into a bomb crater in excitement. Apparently, he hadn't set his radio properly and also didn't see my signaling. I was therefore unable to prevent his disappearing into the bomb crater. Only the muzzle brake of his cannon peeked over the edge of the crater. All of a sudden, he once again had radio contact with me and was cursing like a sailor about his bad luck. None of the crew could get out because the Russians had observed everything and fired like madmen at Gruber's tank. It was a sticky situation. Of course, I immediately thought about the pleasant prospects of recovering the tank the next night. On top of everything else, my Tiger had clutch damage and was not available for towing. It was therefore our good fortune that Sveti came up front that night in his freshly repaired tank. Together with Kirscher, he retrieved Little Max and his crew out of the unpleasant situation. Unfortunately, not everything went smoothly. The Russians began to shoot like crazy again at the appearance of the two tanks. They knew, of course, that we intended to recover our scuttled Tiger. During the day, they had adjusted their sights on that stupid bomb crater. One of those delayed fuse 15-centimeter mortar rounds, especially designed for fighting tanks, penetrated the radio operator's hatch on one of our tanks. The round impacted almost vertically, and the entire charge, together with parts of the hatch, smashed into the legs of the unfortunate radio operator. The last few days had gone by without casualties, and then, while recovering a vehicle, they had to get this guy. He had just arrived in the company. He had probably just turned 18, and it was his first operation. In our bunker, we applied dressing to the poor guy. He must have had unbearable pain. He was complaining about the pain in his left foot. He hadn't noticed yet that it wasn't there anymore. It was a terrible sight, and one that moved me more deeply than all the operations of the last few days. I saw a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. After all, he was still just half a child who found himself lying there in the tank with shattered feet and horrific pains. He was only babbling incoherent sentences. "Herr Lieutenant, she'll probably never see me again. Oh, it hurts so much in my left foot. Does it have to be amputated? I wonder whether she can still make it. She's already lost 2 sons and now me. Herr Lieutenant, will you write to her?" The babbling of the severely wounded youth, who continuously talked about his mother, shook me to the core. I comforted him as well as I could and made sure that he was immediately brought to the field hospital in a Kubelwagen ambulance. I was happy when I discovered that he had survived. They were forced to amputate his left lower leg, but he could see his mother again, and that was the main thing. I later saw him in the replacement battalion, and both of us were very happy to see each other. Perhaps the leg that he lost also saved his life. Who can know for sure? On March 22nd, the Russians attacked Point 33.9 in the Boot for the last time. They were beaten back with the loss of 2 additional tanks. From then on, there was finally quiet in the East Sack. In the period from March 17 to 22, we had knocked out 38 Russian tanks, 4 assault guns, and 17 artillery pieces in the heavy defensive fighting. We could therefore be quite satisfied with our success. The only casualty was the severely wounded 18-year-old tanker. This also wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been forced to recover Gruber's tank. Ivan made one more try to reach his objective. Because he realized he couldn't get anywhere attacking from the east sack, he came up with the idea of landing from the sea. We already knew about this intention from prisoner statements. Even the trains near Silomet were prepared for Operation Sea Lion. The defensive countermeasures took place under this code name. The Russians attempted their landings north of the Kinderheim at Maricula. We immediately moved to the coast with a few tanks. Most of the landing craft had already been destroyed at sea by the Pak guns of the Feldherrenhalle division. When we arrived, we only saw burning boats milling about on the water. A few Russians were able to reach the coast, but they were soon taken prisoner behind our front. As we determined later, they were magnificently well-equipped elite troops. According to their statements, the operation had been precisely practiced. It wasn't supposed to take place until the breakthrough in the East Sack had succeeded. But even though Ivan had not been able to succeed there, the Russians attempted the landing anyway. As a result, there was only the senseless sacrifice of good soldiers. Despite the Russian fiasco, the specter of Operation Sea Lion haunted us for a long time, especially at night. For the remainder of our stay in the Narva sector, however, there wasn't a repeat performance of the operation. At the end of March, our tanks were withdrawn from the 61st Infantry Division sector. We prepared for a new operation. It was called the Elimination of the East Sack and the West Sack. Its execution was in the hands of Oberst Graf Strachwitz. When we assembled in Silomet, we were all in need of an overhaul, our Tigers needing one just as much as we did. At our support base on the Baltic coast, we finally had a few days' time to recover. That was simply a must for the crews of our 3 tanks. During the previous few operations, they hadn't received any rest either by day or night. Despite all toughness and willingness to go to battle, an individual's ability to perform has its limits. In many respects, our rest period was interesting and relaxing for me. I especially enjoyed being able to hear good music on the radio again. In that regard, there was always a small fight going on with the commander. I was a lover of more serious music. He, on the other hand, liked modern and easy listening music. In our rest area, I won the affection of a 4-legged friend, Hasso, a German shepherd. Von Schiller had picked him up from the military police for a bottle of schnapps. He was of no value to the police after he had knocked out his teeth on a brick. Hasso was exceptionally well trained and brought me a lot of happiness. He climbed ladders effortlessly, jumped amazingly high, and even fetched things out of the strong current of the Baltic. He would guard a piece of wood until he was relieved of his duties by a command. Hasso was the only dog I ever saw that let a piece of meat drop on command, even after he had already had it in his mouth. He accompanied me everywhere and placed his head on my feet at night on the sofa. Whenever it was time for him to relieve himself in the mornings, he licked my hand until I was awake and went out with him. Although he was a company dog and had a lot of masters, he was especially attached to me and also never forgot his good training. I was thus able to have all sorts of enjoyable diversions during my rest period. But my happiness didn't remain undisturbed. The commander was always somewhat jealous of me because I got along so well with everyone. He wasn't quite so jealous of all the hardships that went together with these successes. He was always surprised at our hunter's luck, whereas he still hadn't been able to knock out a single tank. The fact that we were always in action, as opposed to him, must have escaped him. Whenever 2 tigers in our company were mission capable, I was always sitting in one of them. After all, how long had we been forced to endure at Lembitu without accomplishing anything until we finally earned our keep? Von Schiller reminded me of the fair-weather hunter. He believed he could simply go into the woods to shoot the deer that was waiting for him. I got along with him when both of us were alone because I was mindful of his faults. Things also went well whenever I was on an operation, and he held the company together at the support base. In Silomet, however, the mood was often somewhat tense. I made it a habit to be with the men a lot. That didn't suit the commander at all. He had the opinion that one always had to maintain a distance. Thank God, I didn't find that necessary. I never experienced anyone acting improperly toward me. I was therefore always between a rock and a hard place. I had to calm down the NCOs whenever they complained about the commander, and I also had to convince the CO constantly that our men were great guys whom you could depend on. Perhaps my men were also especially excitable because of the heavy action. In any case, a bomb exploded one day, and it exploded far worse than I had feared. It was Ivan, moreover, who gave rise to the occasion. Even in our reserve position, he didn't always allow us our well-earned rest. He fired over us and into the sea with long-range artillery, which was south of Narva. Actually, he wanted to hit the Rollbahn, but his rounds flew too far. Whenever they raced over our heads, we had the feeling that they were taking the roof with them. We had an unpleasant barrage like that every couple of hours. We would hear the muffled report in the distance and could count off to the second to the point they raced past us. The sentry had to report the start of an artillery barrage immediately. It was a standing order that everyone then had to race into the cellar of the house. This order was completely justified, as was proven when the Russians shot short once. A sergeant from maintenance and a company clerk were killed by shrapnel when they were en route to their bunkers but could not reach them in time. Therefore, caution was completely in order, that much was certain. It upset the NCOs who slept in the other room next to both of us, however, that the commander was always the first one jumping through the hole in the floor going to the cellar. He did this even though such haste wasn't called for. Besides, according to military tradition, the leader was supposed to be the last one to think about his personal safety. The company Kamo sergeant, Funkmeister Shotrov, an otherwise quiet, dependable man and an exemplary soldier, lost his nerves, insulted von Schiller, and almost became physical. He thus had to be taken into custody for mutiny. Von Schiller insisted that I immediately go with him to the court-martial authority. We had to go to a meeting anyway with the commander of the Grossdeutschland Panzer Regiment, Oberst Graf Strachwitz. During the ride, I urged von Schiller not to destroy the entire life of a proven soldier such as Shotrov. I finally got to the point that he became indecisive. Perhaps he also thought to himself that things could be said in front of a court-martial that would be unpleasant for him. In any case, and to my great relief, he didn't get out at the seat of the court-martial. Instead, he turned to me and said, "Okay, Otto, I've thought it all over. Because of you, I want to personally punish Shotrov's unbelievable behavior. I will arrest him and then take him into combat with me." I kept quiet. A great burden was lifted from my shoulders. Funkmeister Shotrov was thus given the most severe punishment a company commander could mandate. He received confinement to quarters. He then had to serve as the radio operator in the commander's tank during the next few operations. The latter punishment was doubly false psychologically. First, assignment to the line elements could not be a punishment. It was required as a matter of course from all of us. It should be noted that Shotrov had frequently requested permission to participate in at least a few operations. He had always been turned down because his position could not be easily replaced. Finally, von Schiller would never have been allowed to take him along in his tank, as was soon determined. This concludes the 11th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.